Excited to introduce Kathryn Hulick and Kelly Weinersmith this afternoon to discuss their books, Welcome to the Future and Soonish. Kathryn Hulick is a freelance writer, editor, and former Peace Corps volunteer. She writes regularly for publications like Science News for Students and Muse Magazine. She has also published numerous nonfiction books on topics such as video games, artificial intelligence, energy technology, and dinosaurs. Hulick's favorite part of writing about science is getting to speak with researchers in many different fields. Once she spoke with an expert on parallel universes while he was shoveling snow from his driveway. Another time, she called a biologist who was out in the field in Africa watching a herd of elephants. In addition to writing, she enjoys hiking, gardening, painting, and reading. Hulick lives in Massachusetts with her husband, son, and dog. Dr. Kelly Weinersmith is an adjunct faculty member in the biosciences department at Rice University. She studies parasites that manipulate the behavior of their hosts, and her research has been featured in The Atlantic, Nat Geo, BBC World, Science, and Nature. When she isn't studying nature's creepiest wonders, she is writing books with her husband, Zach Weinersmith, creator of the Saturday morning breakfast cereal comics. Their first book, Soonish, 10 Emerging Technologies That'll Improve and or Ruin Everything, was a New York Times bestseller. Their next book is about future of humans in space and will be published through Penguin Press. Kathryn and Kelly are going to speak with each other for about 25-30 minutes, and then we'll open it up to your questions that have been submitted through the Q&A. And now I'll ask our panelists to turn their camera and mics back on, and I'll turn the event over to them. Kathryn, Kelly?
All right, so I'm
Thanks,
going. Yeah, hi everyone.
Thank
Thank you so much for coming, and I've got my book here to show you. This is Welcome to the Future. The release date keeps moving, as some of you have noticed, but I just found out that Bank Square Books and Savoy Bookshop and Café do have it in stock. So a lot of independent bookstores have been able to get it, even though you can't get it from Amazon until the 30th. So go to your local independent bookstore and you can get it sooner. And if you order one, I do have some lovely little book plate stickers that I can mail to you. ick@gmail. I should, at some point when I'll go grab the stickers, I should have had them next to me, but I can show you what they look like. But I'm happy to do that since I can't sign for you in person, obviously, over the over the internet. So Kelly and I are going to talk to each other, and I just want to say how much research goes into writing a book like the ones that like mine, and then I have Kelly's over here. For my and I also read a ton of books, and one of the books that I read while researching my book was this one. It actually came out right when I started my research, and I bought it, and I was like, oh yay, and I was also like, oh no, like, is this going to compete with my book? But it's not really, because this one's kind of for grown-ups and it's a lot funnier than mine. But so they're kind of for different audiences, but they're about similar topics. And as I read this, I was like, Kelly Weinersmith, Kelly, that name seems familiar. And it dawned on me that I had spoken with her in 2016 for a story I wrote about parasites, which has nothing to do with technology. But we had spoken, and I had written an article for Science News for Students called Zombies Are Real, which is probably one of my best titles ever. And I had her wonderful quotes in there about fish or parasites that turn fish into zombies. So that's how we met. And I then had purchased this book without even knowing it was by someone I knew. And I thought, you know, this is perfect. We really have to, you know, talk to each other face to face about our books. And that's what we're going to do today. So first, Kelly's going to talk to me, and then I'm going to ask her some questions.
Yeah, and I'm super excited because when you got back in touch with me, I was like, oh, I remember this was such a fun interview, and I read, and the article turned out I thought great. And then you sent me a copy or PDF of your book, and I read it over, and the artwork is great, and it was super interesting. And you picked some tech that we didn't talk about, so it was like information that was new to me and was really enjoyable. And so I'm super excited that we're chatting today as two tech geeks. So as I mentioned, you know, the tech that we decided to talk about didn't overlap 100%.
Yeah.
So, you know, how did you pick which, you know, of all the emerging technologies you could have talked about, how did you pick the ones that you decided to chat about in your book?
Well, I started each chapter with where the technology is going. So I tried to think of the 10 most fascinating future worlds that kids would wonder about. So I really wanted to, you know, excite the imagination with what the world could be like in the future. So that's really where I started from, is what's the really cool future that we could get to that you see in like movies or science fiction, and then how would we get there? So some of my chapters, like the one on teleportation and the one on like a replicator machine like in Star Trek that can print anything, those things seem to me to be somewhat impossible. But I started there and then kind of backed up, like with the teleportation chapter, I backed up to, well, virtual reality can teleport you virtually. So that's what we're going to talk about in this chapter. And then with the replication, I'm like, well, 3D printing can kind of print you anything. You just need to you can't just put any matter in there. You have to put, specific matter in to get out what you want. So that's kind of where I started each chapter from. And actually, one funny thing is that probably the chapter in my book that the most kids are going to gravitate towards is the last one that I thought of. And it wasn't even in my original proposal. It is the one on, here it is right here. I'll show you. Pet dinosaurs.
Ooh.
What kid would not want to read about pet dinosaurs and whether Jurassic Park could actually happen? But believe it or not, I didn't even think of that till like the final hour when my book was doing like a month, and I'm like, I need to do, and I had one chapter left to write, and I was going to write it about the Internet of Things. And I'm like, and this idea occurred to me, and I was like, I got to trash the Internet of Things, and I got to write about dinosaurs. So that's what I did. It was kind of crazy, but I managed to get it in there.
That's all. We talked a little bit about de-extinction and focused on mammoths. Yeah. And it's just like, it is absolutely such a fascinating topic. Yeah. Such cool stuff getting done in that area.
Definitely.
So you mentioned, or in the intro, Anastasia mentioned that you have done all sorts of wild interviews with people in crazy places.
Yeah.
I think my favorite part of writing Soonish was the interview process, and just like each field has its own really unique culture. And then, of course, some of the people working on these things have like amazing, quirky personalities. Mm-hmm. And like, I think my favorite interview was I interviewed a guy who won the Nobel Prize for economics. And halfway through the interview, I realized it must have been his like exercise hour because he was on the treadmill, which explains why he was sort of running out of breath. But like, if you've got a Nobel Prize winner on the phone, you're happy to have them during the exercise time. Yeah. So do you have like a favorite interview or a favorite culture of a field that you'd like to tell us about?
Yeah, I mean, that happened to me several times too, where I'd talk to someone and realize that they're like walking their dog right now. Like this is when they have free time for interviews with the press. Is like, it's they don't set aside work time. It's like during their exercise time.
Yep.
But yeah, actually, the really cool thing that happened is for my fusion chapter, I spoke with 3 different people, and one of them happened to be the education coordinator for the American Physical Society, which is like the professional organization for physicists. And after I told them like, hey, my book's coming out soon, thank you so much for all your help, he's like, hey, do you want to come to our annual meeting? Do you want to come sign books in Pittsburgh at our annual meeting? And I was like, well, yeah. So I actually just got back from that trip. That was this week. And it was like one of the most fun things I've ever done because I'm such a science geek. I was like, I am here with the people who are making fusion happen. It was so cool. Like, it was awesome. Like these are the people that they're all plasma physicists. That's what the name of the meeting is, plasma physics. Some of them are working on fusion. A lot of them are working on other stuff like plasma is very common in space. So a lot of them are working on space related things. But I also did an event with local middle school kids. So, I mean, in terms of interviews, that one led to a great ending that I made all these new relationships and met all these new people, and all the scientists were super excited to buy my book for their kids because they would love to explain what they do. And one reason I write about science is because a lot of scientists, Kelly's an exception, but a lot of scientists are not so good at explaining what they do to young people. So a big part of my job.
It's a different skill.
It is a totally different skill. So, I mean, I see my job as a translator, a science translator. I talk to these scientists who are so deep in this area, and often it's such a specific thing they study, like this tiny little, corner of whatever fusion or whatever that they're an expert in. And I take that from multiple different people and put it together into something that not only kids can understand, but that kids are going to think is totally awesome and amazing and engaging. So that's and the interviews are my favorite part too. I just absolutely love them.
Yeah, that's been one of the things that's been kind of a bummer about writing a book in the middle of Soonish, is that I would have gone to a lot more conferences and done a lot more face-to-face. Writing a book in the middle of the pandemic. But so fewer face-to-face interviews have happened, which is kind of a bummer. But whatever.
But Zoom has taken off. Like I used to do all my interviews over the phone, and now I can Zoom people, and it's like it's such a better interview experience when you can see the person's face. I just am so happy that that's become the standard. I mean, some people still want to talk to me on the phone, like usually they're older and just I guess haven't transitioned into the new world yet. but most people I talk to now for all of my interviews, for all of my projects, are happy to do Zoom, and it's really, I think, made them a much better experience for both of us, I hope. For me, certainly.
The rise of Zoom has really
has
definitely been good for stuff like that.
Yes.
So we decided to focus our book on sort of like older audiences, sort of like, you know, seniors in high school and up is sort of what we were thinking. What made you decide that, you know, not only did you want to write to teenagers in general, but also why should teenagers be reading about tech?
Well, I have always written for kids and teenagers. It's like something. When I was 10, I remember I didn't want to get any older. I was never one of those kids who was like, I want to be a teenager. I want to drive. I was like, nope, this is good. I like being 10. So I kind of, I still engage with that age very easily. And I still remember what it was like to be that age. And that it's just that sense of wonder that kids have. I just love that. I love how open they are to new ideas and how curious they are about the world. And I just respond to that. You know, I don't know, adults are kind of boring in a lot of ways. You know, they're kind of stuck in their ways, and kids are just so interested in everything. And that to me is really inspiring. And so everything I've ever written has been for young people. I've never really tried to write for grownups. And I especially think it's important for kids and teens to learn about technology and science, because like that's what we're passing on to them. Like, especially for this book, my goal is that kids are going to learn about these technologies and then have make their voices heard, not necessarily becoming scientists, but perhaps getting involved in the policies that will make these technologies, good for the world rather than terrible. Because that's really like the driving point. You know, the point I'm trying to make in this book is that what do we want to do with these technologies? At first, and this actually changed as I was writing it. At first, I was thinking, you know, the whole point of this book is going to be what's possible. You know, is it going to be possible to teleport? Is it going to be possible to have pet dinosaurs? And when? But those are really, really hard questions to answer, and not all that interesting, it turned out. I was much more interested in why and how are we going to make these things come about? So the ethics became hugely important to me as I was working on it. And I actually rewrote the entire book at one point with that in mind, like that I wanted to change the main theme from one of possibility to one of, you know, should we do this? Not can we, but should we? And so that's what the book is now. It really, the heart of it is the ethics. Like, yes, maybe we could have pet dinosaurs, but do we want them? It didn't go so well in Jurassic Park and Jurassic World. They ate a lot of people, you know. Like that's a very obvious one for kids to grasp. But there's other things too, like dinosaurs could disrupt the ecosystem. They might not be very happy because there won't be very many other dinosaurs around at first. You know, they might have ways of existing in the world that we didn't expect. So there's a lot of things that could happen if we make a decision to have a certain technology that I want kids to consider. Like, it sounds really cool to have a robot that picks up your room for you and does the dishes and walks the dog, but maybe you would miss doing some of that stuff yourself. You know, maybe you like having responsibility and taking care of things. You know, maybe people wouldn't be able to make money if robots were doing all the work. Like, I want kids to really not just think about the cool side of this technology, but think about the sides that may not be so cool and how they feel about it. Because I think all their voices matter. And I really want them to see themselves in science and see their own, opinions being matter and being heard. Like, I think a lot of times kids get left out of the conversation around these things, and I don't think they should be. I think they should be able to contribute and say what they think about technology and the world and the future, because it's their future. They're going to be the ones who live in it.
Yeah, and one of the things that I loved about your book so much was that you got into the ethics. So when I was doing my interviews, one thing that kept coming up was I would ask these scientists and engineers, like, what are the potential negative implications of the technology you're working on? And so often they would be like, oh, I haven't, it's probably fine. I haven't thought too much about it. And like, it kind of blew me away how little they were thinking about it. And so I think it's critical that we are getting the younger generations to be thinking about how this technology gets rolled out, and do we want it or not, and how it can impact our lives. And I don't think that my generation is thinking about it as much as we should. And I'm hoping the next generation is thinking more.
Hopefully. Yeah. And I didn't just reach out to scientists about this. I did reach out to like ethicists as well, or people who are working on, or scientists who have a focus on that kind of thing, on ethics or policy, who are, activists as well as scientists. So I was actually, especially during that rewrite I talked about, I was seeking out people who could speak to those questions specifically.
They can be hard to find.
Yes. Yes, they can be. but I did find people who would talk about it. So that was good.
Great.
Yeah.
And I'm so glad that people like you exist, like people who feel like it's easy to talk to kids, because I am like actually exactly the opposite. When I was 3, my mom used to joke that I was 3 going on 33, because we'd walk out of the house and I'd be like, did you remember to turn off the oven?
Oh,
and when I'm in the room with kids, it's like I'm like a deer in headlights. I don't know what to say to them, and so I am not at all a natural. But my daughter is reading like science comics, and she's going to be reading your book. She's a little bit too young for it, but she'll be there pretty soon. We've got our copy. And so anyway, I'm so glad that there are people who can write to that audience, who can like connect with kids, because it's just not my skill set. Doesn't come naturally to me.
Oh, thanks.
So those were the questions that I had. So do you want to tell us about like 1 or 2 other projects that you've done for kids that you would love everyone to know about?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I could talk about my first book, Strange But True. So I think a lot of the people who are here are friends and family of mine, so they already know about it, but I will. Here, I'm going to move the camera a little bit because I've got it right here. We go. So this is Strange But True. So this is 10 of the world's greatest mysteries explained. And Welcome to the Future was imagined originally as kind of a sequel to it. As you can see, they kind of match. It's a, matching set. So this book is about mysteries like Bigfoot and aliens and sea monsters, and how you can understand those things using science. So, and critical thinking. So the heart of this book is to help kids understand how to think about mysteries without losing their wonder about them. Because this book was really for me as a 10-year-old, when I was not at all interested in science. That came later. I really loved magic, and I actually thought palm reading was real at one point. I was really into this stuff, and I thought science was ruining it by trying to like explain it. And as I got older, I realized that wasn't the case at all, that science adds to the wonder in the world by asking questions and pursuing real answers, not just making things up, but pursuing actual answers. And it seems like every scientist I know just ends up with 10 more questions every time they research something. It's like they ask one and then they have 10 more, and they may answer half of one, but then they have like another 10. Has that been your experience in science?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So I mean, like, to me, that's just multiplying the wonder in the world, not getting rid of it. And so that's really what I wanted to get across to kids in this book, is that yes, you can wonder about these things. I want you to wonder about these mysteries. I want you to be curious about aliens and ghosts, but I want you to be curious about it in a very careful, skeptical, critical way. So that was really the takeaway message. And I tried to explain what might actually be going on other than the paranormal in these stories, but while leaving room open, because you never know. Like a good scientist also has a great imagination. So it's important not to try to get rid of that, not to, make fun of someone who has a weird or crazy idea, because sometimes those turn out to be true. You never know.
Totally. Yeah. and the artwork in both of those books is really great. Can you tell us a little bit about how? Yeah.
I always forget to credit my illustrators, but I should do that every single time. So this book is illustrated by Gordy Wright, and this book is illustrated by Marci Wolski. And I never actually met either illustrator, because the way it usually works in publishing is that, I sell the text to a publisher and then they hire an illustrator to illustrate it. So in your case, it was a little different because you already had an illustrator in your husband. But in my case, that's how it worked. So I never actually met them, but I did get to, kind of see their art as it went through the process and give some feedback. So that was really fun. And they both did a fantastic job.
They did. And so is the way that it works, they like do a layout draft and send it to you and you respond?
Yeah, for my first book, it was a little more streamlined than my second one. For the first one, I did see sketches, like I saw like pencil sketches and got to comment on them. The second book, I feel like the art was like done, and then they were showing it to me and I was like, well, this is kind of wrong. And they did what they could. Thankfully, none of it was, I didn't need any huge changes, but I didn't really get as much feedback on the second one. I think probably because it got delayed because of the pandemic. So like the schedule was a little all over the place. And people, I think, were just crazy dealing with that, and it disrupted everything. But thankfully, it turned out fine, even without much feedback. What's that?
Did the publisher like give you sort of like a layout of different artists with different looks to choose from, or is it?
No, they said this is the illustrator we want to use, and both times I was like, great, I love them. I mean, maybe if I had hated them, that would have happened, but I just, both times I thought they made a great choice, so I was lucky.
Great.
Yeah.
I feel like it's so interesting seeing how different communities work together with artists. And so like
Yeah.
as a scientist, every once in a while, like, so I study complicated life cycles with parasites. And, sometimes, my words are just not sufficient to explain how creepy or weird or complicated it is. And so every once in a while, I'll sort of reach out to an artist, and just their work is so different than what I do. And just sort of trying to figure, like, I think I must have totally dropped the ball and messed things up a couple different times, where like assuming that, it works this way, but it actually works this other way. And like, I try not to be a pain to artists and ask like for a million different revisions and stuff. But it's so fun. Like, sometimes you've got this complicated idea and you think you know how it's going to work, and then you give it to the artist and they do something you totally didn't expect, but it's way better than you thought.
Oh,
because,
yeah.
of course,
Yeah, that's awesome.
Art is a different skill. Yeah. Yeah. It's great.
So should I interview you now? I think
Sure.
we can switch over. All right. Before we get started, I just want to say that how much I love this book. It is fantastic. And the greatest thing about it to me is that it's funny. Like, I don't do humor that well. I'm like, my book's like deep and serious and like, what's going to happen if robots take over the world? This one's like, hey, what if you put a bunch of fusion scientists together, at a conference? And I actually was at a fusion conference. So that chapter, I'm just going to describe to people the way she describes fusion, because, fusion, if you don't know, is when atoms merge together to form a new heavier element. And this is very, very hard to do. They repel. When atoms get close to each other, they repel each other. So things have to be very hot and dense for it to happen. So in order to explain this, Kelly and Zach compare atoms to fusion scientists at a conference, not like repelling each other because they're all geeks and don't want to talk to each other. So this was in my mind when I was at an actual fusion conference. I'm like, is anyone going to merge like at this conference? I can't find the page right now, but there's some lovely illustrations of that in this book. And I just, as I was reading it, I'm like, this is fantastic. I love that it's funny. I love that they've used cartoons and like put themselves in the cartoons. Like they make fun of themselves in there. Oh, here it is. This is it. This is what I was looking for. There's the fusion scientists. They hate each other, and then they're scared of each other, and then, oh, they're clingy if they get close enough. Anyway, so I wanted to ask you that I've never written anything in collaboration with someone else, and you wrote your book with your husband. So how did you manage that? How did you divide up the work? Do you have any funny stories from working together on this book?
Well, so, as a scientist, most of my papers are a collaborative effort. So I'm pretty familiar with working with other people, but none of the projects are this intense. And so, we didn't really know much about any of these technologies. And so, which sort of makes it seem silly that we decided we were going to be the ones to write the books on this. But so for each topic, we would, order a stack of textbooks on the topic, and then download like a stack of papers that seemed relevant. And then we would divide them between the two of us. And we would take notes on each, and we would go on walks at the end of the day. And I would tell Zach what I learned, and he would tell me what he learned. Cool. Yeah. And so we tried to make sure that even though we were reading different things, we both had just about the same amount of knowledge. And then my job before we would write a chapter would be to read all of our notes over and then do the Kelly draft. And the Kelly draft is sort of the more dry and scientific version, because out of the two of us, Zach is the funnier of the two. And so when the Kelly draft was done, Zach would come through and figure out like, okay, this is maybe, we're not quite sure we're explaining this clearly enough. And then maybe we'd send it to a friend to look at, to tell us if it was a clear enough explanation, or they'd give us comments on what was confusing. And then Zach would add comments, and then I would go do interviews to sort of check to make sure we got everything right, and then get some like flavor in terms of, good quotes. And then Zach would add the artwork. And so it was sort of an iterative process where we'd take turns. And for the most part, it's great because you get double the research done in that amount of time. And you always have someone to sort of check to see if what you wrote made sense. And it's just sort of like a fun collaborative thing. But on the other hand, every once in a while, I would write a draft that Zach really didn't like, or Zach would write a draft that I really didn't like. And we both had to like swallow our pride and be like, okay, I'm not going to take it personally that you don't like the thing I've spent the last 3 weeks on. But like, yeah, it worked out well in the end. I don't know if there are any particularly funny stories. I guess when we went to do the book tour, it was kind of funny the assumptions people made about who did what. So we were on NPR's Planet Money with Kai Ryssdal, and like Zach and I both love him and love his show. And he on air made the assumption that I had done all of the writing and all of the research because I was a scientist, and all Zach had done was the artwork. And we didn't correct him because we didn't want to like, ruin his role. But like afterwards, we were like, oh no, Zach should at least be getting credit for half the research. Yeah. And then other people thought that I was like Zach's fact checker. And so anyway, people make weird assumptions about the division of labor, but it was pretty even for Soonish. It's a lot more even for this book now because my job is a little different. I have some more time. But so anyway, for our upcoming book, it's even a bit more even. So yeah, it's fun.
That's great. Actually, that sounds awesome to have someone else to help read the research materials. Cause I would go to the library and get like a stack of 20 books. Like the librarians were always like passing them over to me. Like, you want this one and this one and this one and this one. I'm like, yeah, I'm a writer.
It's an incredible amount of research to get this stuff right,
Yeah.
Because if you just read one person's story, they might have a totally different view of it than what everybody else is doing. So you got to read the same thing from like 5 people to make sure everything is getting it right. And yeah, it's exhausting.
So you asked me how I picked just 10 technologies. So I'm going to turn that one back at you. So how'd you pick your 10 and what maybe got left on the cutting room floor that you miss?
So we had originally conceived of this book as 50 technologies that we would describe short, like in just, like the funny version of the Wikipedia article. And so as we started going, we were like, oh, but the interesting thing about these technologies is what you still need to do to make it happen. And at some point we felt like, a more interesting book would be one that would possibly get like seniors in high school or freshmen in college thinking like, oh my gosh, this is the problem that needs to be solved to make this technology happen. Yeah. And maybe I could do that. And so like getting into the details about what still needs to happen and then the possible ethical implications, we ended up deciding we wanted to expand on that stuff a lot more. So we winnowed down to 10 and we tried to pick 10 that we thought like, these things could plausibly happen in our lifetimes if the right people were working on them and if funding was spent the right way. And there were a couple technologies where it's hard to fit the right, like you want to make sure you know enough that there's enough information to write about, but not so much that the problems that still need to get solved are just like tiny details.
Right.
So for example, we had a chapter on advanced nuclear reactors. Like a chapter had to get cut at the end, and we decided to cut that one, not because that technology isn't important, because we think it is, but because the remaining problems are sort of like, well, if you use just a little bit more of this fuel that's a little bit cleaner, and it was just sort of like nitpicky details that just weren't holding the audience when they were reading it. And so anyway, finding the technology that's like the right amount of development was a little tough. And who knows, maybe fusion won't happen in our lifetime, but I sure hope it does.
Actually, this summer, there was an update from the people doing laser fusion that I found that I wasn't in time to put on in my book. They did reach ignition. They got more energy. They got more energy out than they put in. Yes. It's not, yeah, just this summer. So they were all partying at this conference because of that.
I think Commonwealth Fusion was making some good progress also, and they're in Boston. I mean, there's lots of reasons to be excited.
It is coming soon. I think it is really. I mean, there's a lot of steps between that and actually getting energy, like making it into a power plant, but it's getting there. Yeah, and so let's talk. I wanted to talk to you a little more about the ethics because I said that I want kids to think about what sort of future is best for the world and what their opinions and thoughts are. And it sounds like you were targeting younger people as well. I mean, maybe older than me, but still people who are in college or just out of high school and maybe might want to get involved in these technologies. So when it comes to the potential impact, like what are you most worried about and what are you most hopeful for of the technologies you wrote about?
But I feel like one of the things that's tough about that question is that for so many of these technologies, something that goes wrong could be something that you haven't thought of yet. And whether or not these things go wrong depend on how people decide to use the technologies and what rules are put in place ahead of time. So, for example, for the personalized medicine chapter, I'm a little less worried about some of the implications of like completely understanding what our genome says, because in 2008, the genome Information Non-Discrimination Act or something like that. A bill was passed saying that you can't discriminate against someone based on what their genetics says might happen to them in the future. So like you can't not hire someone because you need them to pick up heavy boxes and their genome suggests that maybe they're going to have heart trouble when they're older and they might not be able to do that anymore. And so like if people are forward thinking, then you can say like, all right, this technology is coming. What are the bad aspects? How do we try to minimize those bad aspects? And so that's, you know, when people are thinking ahead, that's good. So now I'm trying to figure out what I am most worried about. Gosh, I'm not too worried about most of gene drives make me a little bit nervous. So gene drives are this idea where like you can genetically modify an organism so that when they have babies, their babies have the exact same genetic material that they have. So usually, you know, when genetic material gets combined, you get a version from the mom and a version from the dad. And so if there's like a good version, it gets, you know, half of the time the kids will get it and half the times they won't. With the gene drive, you can make it so that all the kids get the version that the gene drive is attached to. And so this is being used to try to genetically manipulate mosquitoes so that they can't transmit diseases or they can't survive in the wild. But we don't understand this technology very well, and it passes so quickly that we're sort of introducing something into these systems that we don't understand, spreads like crazy, and it's kind of scary, and it hasn't always worked the way we thought it was going to. So for example, last time I read about a follow-up thing that didn't make it in Soonish where the gene drive didn't work well, and actually the mosquitoes, I think they even bred more than usual, and they ended up with more mosquitoes than usual. So like the opposite of the intention. And so I think some of the tinkering with genetic stuff is what makes me the most nervous if it's not really carefully regulated and we're not super sure we understand what's happening ahead of time. But what about you? What out of the technologies that you talked about?
Yeah, I mean, I tend to be an optimist as well. Like in the genetic engineering chapter, the feedback I got from my critique group is like, you know, tone this back, because I'm like all for it. And there's a lot of people who are not so for, you know, genetically modified things. But I just see a lot of positives in it. And I know that's one of those controversial things out there, but there are potential issues. But they are safe to eat. I do want to put that message out there. GMOs are perfectly safe to eat. If you're worried about them, it's because you're worried about maybe their effects on farming practices or the soil, or, you know, that's really what the impact is. They're not dangerous at all for human consumption. But anyway, so yeah, I'm really an optimist. But I would say the thing I think about the most, and originally I wanted to write a book just about AI, honestly. But I had to, where you started with like 50 things and had to turn it back. I started where I wanted to write a book about AI and had to like expand it because that wasn't enough to get anyone's attention. So for me, like AI is the thing that I worry about it, but I also am excited for it. Like I do worry like where it could go, you know, if computers are taking over all these things that humans normally do, if they become conscious or able to make decisions for themselves in a way that, you know, beyond what they're doing now, which is not very much at all. Or even just the way that, you know, there's a lot of issues in AI with them perpetuating like human prejudices and racism just because humans design the AI. Like AI is not objective. It is whatever the designers make it to be. And so if they have biases, those will show up in the software. So it's stuff like that that's going to, you know, we really need to think about those problems ahead of time. And I'm really hopeful for things like, you know, I'm really hopeful for all of them. I think that, you know, if people do this stuff with forethought and care and conversation, that most of these technologies really have the possibility to you know, benefit everyone and improve things for everyone.
Yeah.
You know, deal with some of the messes we've created, like climate change, or, you know, or all these diseases, like a pandemic. You know, that's science is what saved us from this pandemic in a lot of ways. You know, genetic engineering is what gave us these vaccines so quickly. So it's really like it's already making a difference, this technology. So I am an optimist. I really am.
Yeah, I mean, if you went back to like when the Black Death was around and you told people that like, oh, when our pandemic was solved in a year with vaccines that vaccines in a year. I mean, it's incredible. It was from a year, but like the fact that it was solved in that amount of time is amazing. So do you have a new book project lined up?
I do, but I don't think I can say very much about it yet. It's not official, but I am I'm hoping to write a graphic novel, so that's what I'm working on.
Ooh,
I can't say much
cool.
about it, but hopefully I'll have more news about that in the next couple months. I did want to ask you one final question about your future projects, and also the fact that you research parasites, but you wrote about technology. So how did that happen? And what are the new projects that you're working on?
So I have this weird fear of getting bored. And I spent my whole life trying to avoid getting bored. And so even though we didn't know anything about technology, we were like, well, that sounds fun. Let's tackle that.
Yeah.
And so that was like, you know, an excuse to read about something totally different than parasites. And I mean, the parasites I study are fascinating, in my opinion, but tech is fascinating too. And then we decided to jump into the deep end of another pool and write about space. And we didn't know anything about space. We've been researching it for 4 or 5 years now. And we've become experts in space law, the history of private property rights,
Nice.
you know, where you might settle in space and how the human body responds to that, whether or not we'll be able to have families in space. You know, so we've been just kind of trying to get a realistic view of what life would be like, what kind of legal hurdles would need to be overcome, and what kind of biological hurdles would need to be overcome. And then just sort of like exploring what initial settlements, like what their setup will be like. Will it be like a commune? Actually, most communes fail, so hopefully not. And so we're, you know, exploring these various metaphors, and yeah, it's been super interesting. I have not been bored for at least a decade while we've been working on these projects.
Yeah, you know,
I kind of wish I was bored now.
Yeah, that's what I tend to write about things that I know nothing about. Like I mean, I have written a lot of articles about technology in the past, but some of the chapters in this book I knew nothing about when I started them. And that to me it's really the fun part, to like dive into something, and I love learning, and I love finding out about these things. And I think that helps you a lot of the time, not having the background knowledge, because you ask questions that someone who's steeped in that field might not think to ask. And maybe they're stupid questions, but maybe they're insightful. You never know. You just have to ask them.
Yeah. Yeah, well, and I think the longer you work on something, the easier it is for you to forget what parts of the problem were hard for you to understand initially. And so if you don't know anything about it and you jump into it, I think it's easier to explain it to other people, because it was just a month ago. Right. Yeah, just a month ago, you were like, oh, fusion, I just don't understand. Why are they repelling? And it's just, you know, easier for you to remember, like, okay, this is a hard part that I need to be careful to explain, because
that's a really good point. Yeah, I hadn't thought of that the fact that I have to work so hard to understand it myself makes it easier for me to explain it to others, because I've just, recently managed to synthesize this information in my own brain. So it's easier to kind of give it to others. Yeah, that makes sense.
The struggle has been more recent. Should we invite Anastasia back?
Yes, we should, I think.
What a fascinating conversation. This has been so interesting. So I have a couple questions for you guys, but before I dive into those, I just want to remind our audience, if you have questions, submit them in the chat. You can drop them in the Q&A. Suzanne had asked a question about ethics, so I'm not going to ask it because you guys really covered that like perfectly. But as you guys were talking, I noticed that a lot of the technology that you're talking about is not what I think the average person would consider tech, in the sense of, I think when people think about tech who aren't really aware of the science world, they're like, oh, a phone, that's technology, or a computer, or an electric car. Did you cover any sort of those more mainstream technologies in your books?
I mean, I guess the most techie technology I covered is robots. But I guess that's a good point, that by technology, a lot of the stuff we're talking about is just science, like scientific endeavors in general. Including genetic engineering, medical, innovation, space exploration. Like it really runs, the gamut from all these different types of things. But yeah, robots and AI were the most techie technology I covered.
And we tried to avoid, talking about things that like are already in your pocket, like your iPhone, and, people hear about electric cars pretty often. And so we tried to pick things that we thought were either far enough in the future that people would learn something, because maybe they don't know that much about it because it's not part of their life, or was like something that we thought was misunderstood. So we feel like people talk about fusion a lot, but they don't really understand why we don't have fusion yet, despite the fact that we've been working on it for so long. And so we thought like, well, we can try to make make it clearer why we don't have it yet, so people can believe that we could have it one day, and maybe they'll stay excited about the technology. But yeah, it was hard to pick which text to talk about.
Yeah, totally. So both your books are focused on the future, but I think the future is a really interesting sort of topic when you look at it historically. So you look at like the 70s and 80s, or, you know, like the Jetsons with their flying cars and all of that tech and the robots in the house. And then you look at the fact that I think it's almost kind of inconceivable to think that computers are really not that old. And, you know, cell phones have really only been these little pocket computers for 15 years. What do you think the world is going to sort of look like as we see the emergence of the technologies that you are talking about in your books?
Well, I think there's probably 100% chance that whatever the dominant technology is 20 years from now is not in either of our books.
Yeah.
Given what happened with computers, I mean, people are terrible at predicting what's going to come next. But if I had to choose, the way I see things going in the future is biological technology, that we're going to have living technology, like living microbes and living systems, like we're going to grow houses or whatever. We're going to have, you know, things that are grown, not just made, that can like go in our bodies and take care of us, that can, you know, produce things we need. Like, to me, that biotech is where I saw the most potential for transforming the world in ways that people maybe haven't imagined yet.
I think Kathryn is probably right, but I also am, like, in general, a really not fun person to interview about this topic, because Zach and I in particular were like, we are not making predictions. We are not trying to give like dates when we think this is going to happen. We're just like, these are the problems that need to be overcome. These are the problems that we think are the big problems that need to be overcome. Sometimes it turns out something you hadn't expected is the thing that ends up being extra hard after you jump the first hurdle. But for so many of these things, it depends on like someone deciding that it's worth $1 billion to get over this hurdle. And, you know, it's hard to know, you know, if you're going to get the money and if people are going to decide it matters enough to solve the problem. And so I try not to do too much predicting, which I know is me being no fun.
Yeah. And the money thing is a good point too, because I talked about that in the space chapter. Like, the reason we made it to the moon is because we poured billions of dollars into it. Like, we could have fusion already if we poured billions of dollars into that. Like, it's just a matter, like, a lot of times it's just people can't get the funding to do the research needed to get to a goal. So it's, you know, people really do, it's not just the scientists who can't figure it out. It's also the support of the society around them. And, you know, people really are choosing what we want in the future by the money we spend and, you know, how we vote and all that. Even if you're not a scientist, you're part of that choice. I mean, one thing I wrote in my introduction is, you know, flying cars are kind of the, you know, future trope, but we do have flying cars. We have helicopters. We just don't want them, you know, constantly overhead. And most people just don't make good helicopter pilots. It's a lot harder to fly one than to drive a car. So like, we have flying cars. We could have them everywhere if we wanted, but we don't want that. It's not very safe, and it's super noisy and polluting. And, you know, it's like, it's just not the future that people wanted, even though we could have it.
Well,
That's a fascinating take.
And history is so important for this stuff too. Like, you know, so you mentioned we got to the moon, but the reason we spent billions of dollars on the moon is because we wanted to beat the Soviet Union. We wanted to show that capitalism beats communism. So we're going to spend billions of dollars. And once we got there and we won, we stopped spending money on it because that like geopolitical goal had been met. And then we pulled back. You know, we sent like 6 more Apollo missions, and then we called it quits because there was no more geopolitical reason to do it. And so, yeah, these things depend on stuff that is way outside of the science and technology on its own sometimes.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Definitely.
So it's been so incredibly fascinating hearing you two talk, and to our audience, I hope you'll pick up a copy of Welcome to the Future and Soonish. Kathryn, Kelly, do you guys have any last words that you'd like to share this afternoon before we wrap up?
I just wanted to reiterate that if anyone does want one of those signed book plate stickers, just feel free to email me your address and I can send you one to put on your copy.
Yeah, absolutely.
And everyone should buy Kathryn's book because it's great.
And Kelly's
book.
book.
To all the teenagers in their lives.
Yeah. And buy Kelly's book too, because it's really funny and fantastic.
Yes, it's so funny. And Kathryn's is so beautiful, and they both make wonderful holiday presents because we're about getting into that season.
Yeah.
Well, thank you both so much for joining us, and thank you to our audience today. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank
Thanks, everyone. I
you.
had a lot of
Thanks.
fun.
Bye. Yeah, me too. This was really
Bye.
fun.